that mic turned on here in just a moment. There you go. You can hear my golden voice. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, we'll close out that chapter, then start on chapter 6 today. Good to see you. Good to hear all the good fellowship that we have this morning. Before we begin, though, let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Heavenly Father, we're thankful for the day, for the blessing of the rain that you've given us, and for all of those blessings many times we overlook. We're thankful for the hour that we have of study. We pray that you bless our time during this hour. Bless those teachers and those learners alike. Bless us in all that we do for you. It's in Jesus' name. Amen. Usually, whenever you are teaching a auditorium class such as this, there's always the idea that, in the auditorium class, no one wants to talk, no one wants to comment or ask questions or things like that. Understandable, large room and that sort of thing. Well, if you were present with us a couple of weeks ago, the last time we discussed 1 Corinthians chapter 5, you can see that that's not always the case. We had a lot of discussion and comments and questions, and I thought it was great. And if you weren't here or you can't quite remember all that we talked about, go to our Facebook page there and you can watch it again. I would encourage you to do that for two reasons. One, you can remember what we talked about and kind of see the questions that were there, but you also get to see the great work of our people up in the booth because whenever I talk, they turn this mic on, and whenever you talk, they turn this one off and turn one of these up here on to try to get a better sound that you can actually hear the person talking. Can't hear it real well, but it helps. So they were turning off and on as it was going, and so they were putting in work. The 2 Sundays ago, Terry and Susan and Andrew and Megan up there in the booth, they were doing great work. So you can see them do that, and I felt for them when I was watching it a little bit later. But chapter 5 of 1 Corinthians, we've talked about the moral issues that were there and present in Corinth and the church's responsibility and response to those moral issues. And so we've come to the end of chapter 5, beginning of chapter 6. But before we do that, I wanted to make sure we kind of review and we understand the points that Paul is making there in chapter 5. Obviously, we've talked about church discipline a great deal because that's what's being discussed there. The church was not doing what they should do. They had someone who was acting as a Christian, claiming to be one, and everyone else was claiming that everything was fine. And so Paul's answer to that was the church discipline here. So that's what we mainly talked about, and that's what a lot of our questions were about on Sunday. And again, I always appreciate classes such as that. But before we go, though, I do want to make sure we understand these last few messages here, reviewing that. The church, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, must guard her purity. The church, when we allow outside influences to change the message, when we change our beliefs and things having to do with not just worship but our lives, we've got a problem. In Revelation chapters 2 and 3, Jesus talked to those 7 churches of Asia, and one of the threats he made was that he was going to remove their candlestick. If they weren't going to be the light they needed to be, if they were going to change the fundamental aspect of the gospel, then he was going to remove their influence, and they weren't going to be his light in the world any longer. And so they needed to guard against changing that, and that's the same thing that the church needs to do today, but also the church of Corinth needed to do as well. Church discipline, secondly, according to chapter 5, must be practiced. It's something that we need to not only practice when it's necessary, but understand and prepare for perhaps in the future. Again, the idea that they were to change that relationship with that person, that is something that was necessary. But if the relationship wasn't there to start with, there's nothing to change. And so the fellowship is needed, but for all of us, that Christian fellowship is something that we should miss when it's been withdrawn from. And if we don't want to do that, or we want to seem like the church at Corinth and be, loving or this kind of thing, and not mention someone who's living in sin, then we're prideful. We ourselves are prideful because of our quote-unquote toleration. And so that's 1 Corinthians 5 as well. Thirdly, Christians must arm themselves against evil in this world. That takes our study. That takes our relationship with each other, our encouragement one with another. And so we need to be encouraged not to join in with the world. And again, I said it before, and I'll say it in chapter 6 and other times as well. I think we spend far too much time railing on what the world is doing and far too little about what we need to do to protect ourselves against it. Yes, we need to point out sin when it's there. I'm not saying that at all. But the world is going to be the world. And that's how it's going to be. We ourselves need to encourage each other and how we can protect ourselves against that. The church at Corinth had allowed the world to get into it or into her. And so that was the problem. Not that the world was the world. That's always going to be the case. And so we need to be encouraged not to join in with the world. And finally, the Christian life is most secure when it is pure. 2 Corinthians 7, verse 1. The other letter that we have that Paul wrote to them, he said, having therefore the promises, dearly beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. Completing holiness. Live your lives so that you're trying to perfect that holiness. Not that we're perfect, but that we are complete in Christ. And that's the job, or that's our goal in the Christian life. As well as James 3 and verse 17, the wisdom that is from above is first pure, peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. The church at Corinth was hypocritical because they claimed one thing and they lived another. They claimed to be different than the world, but when you looked at it, there was no difference between them and the world. And I think it's this last point here that we're making that leads into Paul's next part of the next part of the letter that we call chapter 6. And so we'll look at that today, introduce it. Before we go any further, any questions, any comments? I had all this in chapter 6 prepared last time, and we got so many good comments that we didn't get to it. That's great. I'll take that. All right, let's go to chapter 6. Chapter 5, of course, we've kind of given little titles or something if you take notes, that sort of thing. Moral issues and the church's response to it. Chapter 6, we're going to call Christian responses, kind of going along with the moral issues there. But Christian responses, not just vague, broad responses, but what do we do when someone harms us? Not necessarily physically, but in other ways as well. We'll see that, and we'll try to understand that a little more as we go through here. So Christian responses, I try to give these the short but yet to the point topics, and if you're keeping notes, you can write those there as well. Let's look at verse 1, and then we'll introduce our subject here. Dare any of you, he says, having a matter against another, go to law before the unjust and not before saints. So clearly a different topic here. As we said before, the chapter divisions are not inspired. Some man put those there in the verses as well. Sometimes I agree with them, sometimes I don't. I think chapter 6 is a great chapter division because there's clearly a different topic, subject that's under consideration here. Dare any of you, Paul said, go to law against another. We're going to look more in detail at what this is as we go on here. But chapter 6, verse 1, he uses that phrase, dare any of you. Now, that's King James. Perhaps your version has it worded a little bit differently. But think of this as perhaps your mother used to say to you, or someone, how dare you do this or that? That's the kind of idea that we have here. How dare you go to law and take your brother to law for something that he has done? And so this is the subject that's under consideration here. Paul is telling them that they shouldn't be taking each other to law. And again, we'll go into great detail exactly what they were doing. It seems to be that some of the brethren here in Corinth were taking each other to court in a civil manner, civil suit. They were suing each other for money, reparations of some sort, and looking because of some wrong or perceived wrong, they were looking to get back what was quote unquote theirs. Now, as we'll notice, the Greeks were very fond of civil lawsuits because of the things that I'll mention in our introduction today. The Greeks looked at lawsuits as kind of like an event that you could go and watch. It was a show. It was entertainment in many ways. And the church at Corinth, the Christians there, were taking part in that entertainment in being the front and center of it. And we'll talk about what I mean by that later. Paul forbids it here. He's going to in chapter 6. And obviously you can see from the very first phrase that he uses that this is not something that they, and by extension we, should be involved in today. And again, we'll go over what this means for us today. He says, dare any of you, how dare any of you, having a matter. The idea there is a civil suit in nature. He's not really talking about a criminal case, criminal matter. Paul used the law, the criminal code, Acts 22, verses 25 and 26, to help him on his way when he was going to be beaten He told the Roman soldier that was in charge of him, he said, now is it lawful for you to beat a Roman citizen that's not been tried? And that got things going in the different direction. He used the criminal law there. So it seems to be that he's talking about civil suits, and as he goes on here in chapter 6, hopefully that will become clear. Now, you didn't realize it when you showed up today, but we're going to dip our toes in ancient Greek law for just a little bit. I want us to understand a few things about the law in the first century and perhaps a little bit before that to get a broader view of what Paul is talking about here. Because sometimes when you read chapter 6, you'll have some that will say, well, you can't use the law. You can't go to court. You can't use the court system that's in our nation today. Because Paul said, 1 Corinthians chapter 6. I think if we understand the context in which Paul is talking here, it will help us understand not only what specifically Paul is forbidding here, but it will also help us understand the broad overall point that he's making. Because there are some things that Paul says that don't really apply to us. What does he say when he talks about how to control spiritual gifts? Well, we don't have spiritual gifts today, so that really doesn't apply to us. However, if we understand what Paul is saying about spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14, it helps us understand our gifts today in our context. And so if we understand the overall context, especially here when he's talking about going to law, I think it will help us understand more about what it is that Paul is actually forbidding here. So I have on the screen, I have several of these screens here, something from the Cosmos Society. And this is the Center for Greek Learning or Greek Studies at Harvard University. The website's there if you want to check that out and want to read the whole paper. But they are concentrating mainly on the court in Athens, as you can see from the first word there. But because Athens was a trendsetter, and what happened in Athens usually spread to larger parts of the world, and since Corinth was so close to Athens, we have to assume that the Corinthian court was very similar to that in Athens. Perhaps not as large, but Corinth was a large city, and so it wouldn't have been far off. And so let's read this here, and I'll explain, and even at the end, I'll kind of tell you what you need to hone in on, pay attention there. So he says, the writer here says that Athenian courts heard two types of cases, private and public. The main difference between private and public is the size of the jurors that were there. And we'll show how large those were here in a moment. But there were two different kinds, and you had different reasons for wanting a private or a public case. There were no attorneys in Athenian law. In Greek law, there were no professional lawyers per se. You could hire a speechwriter to help you win your case, but there were no lawyers the way that we think about it today. So there were no attorneys, and complaints could only be brought by individuals. The idea of a corporation suing someone or someone suing a company, that was foreign to ancient people. That's a very modern idea. And so complaints were made by the individuals, Greek citizens, and even those who weren't citizens as well. In the private case, and I focus on that because I think that's what Paul's talking about here, but in private cases, only a person with a personal interest in the case, someone has done something wrong to you or to your family. Now, this could be something wrong as in they embezzled funds and stole from you, or it could have been something of breaking some kind of tradition. There was really nothing that was called frivolous in those days as far as frivolous lawsuits. Now, you were fined if your case was not very good, and so that kind of kept people from bringing anything to court. But you could take anyone to court for basically any reason. But you, the individual, had to be connected to the case in order to make the arguments there. Now, public cases were also brought by individuals. Again, private is a smaller juror selection. Public is a much larger one, and this has a bearing on our understanding of what Paul says. But because they were considered to be of interest to the public cases, they could be brought by any citizen. Again, if there was something of a public nature, someone did something to a piece of property that was public in nature, or someone committed some kind of civil action that was in a public nature, then anyone who witnessed it or anyone who heard about it could bring the suit against the individual there. So any freeborn Athenian male over the age of 18, so really any citizen that was there, if we are applying this to Corinth, it would be any Corinthian male who was above the age of 18. So they could apply and pursue things through the court. In the private cases, litigants were charged court fees. similar to how you would be today if you were to go to court. You could settle the cases outside of court and without actually going to it without any penalty. However, in the private case, when it went to trial and the plaintiff got less than a fifth of the jury's votes, they were charged about 1,000 drachmas at the time and would have to refrain from similar lawsuits in the future. So this is why you would want, in certain cases, if it was a public one and you had a very large jury selection, you would get a larger settlement, but there's a chance that you wouldn't be able to convince 20% of the jury. A private one, it's a smaller settlement, but you have a better chance perhaps of convincing a smaller group of people than you do the larger one. And so you had your options there that you could do. And so the idea there was that you are presenting your case before the jury. We call them jurors. They acted as judge and jury. There was no man in a robe that was the judge that adjudicated the case, but rather the jury was both the judge and the jury. And so if you were able to convince more than 20%, then you weren't fined. And if more than 50% agreed with you, then you won your case. And so this is the idea that he's making here. Hearing the vast majority of cases, there were three kinds of courts in Athenian and also in Corinthian courts. One of them had to do with murder, being physically harmed to people, and crimes such as that. The other kind had to do with maritime trade, economic courts. Won't worry about those. The vast majority of cases in Athenian, Greek, Corinthian, what have you, court cases addressed complaints not involving killing or wounding. These were the civil cases in nature. These popular courts met in various locations, primarily near the agora. Now, this is where we'll look at some of the things that we need to understand for our understanding here. The agora, that word is coming to be meaning a public square mainly. But it was a place at certain points in history where it was a place where there were a grove of trees and people would meet there and discuss things, including the law. It came to mean, however, a very public square somewhere near the city center. The most famous one that you're probably familiar with is the Areopagus or Mars Hill in Athens. Acts 17, Paul went to Mars Hill. That's the Agora of Athens. Now there they tried this second kind, the murders and things like that, there near that place. That's where, right there in the city center, that's where most of the people would be gathered. That's where they tried these cases there. But in Corinth, however, their agora is going to be, I'll draw a box around it here and let you look at it right there. This is the city center of Corinth, obviously a drawing here, illustration of what it could be. In the very top of the picture, you have a large temple, probably to Aphrodite or another one of the major deities that Corinth worshiped. To the right of the screen, you have the large amphitheaters and other places where plays and other things would go on. But here inside that box, it's rectangle in Athens. It was a horse race rink, an arena, before it was the agora. So you can kind of see the shape of the horse racing there if you're familiar with the hippodrome in Rome. And so this would be where the courts would take place. Maybe not right out in the open here, but certainly in the building that is in the top left of that box that's there. But it was a very public place. You can see the entrances to that temple. There were also many shops that were around the outside of it, places to eat, things like that. This was the place to be in Corinth, and it's one of the reasons they selected it for the places where the courts would be. Now, if you were standing right at the entrance to that temple, and for those watching on our Facebook feed, in the top right right up here in the top right of the box. If you were standing there and you were looking towards the middle of the left side, you would see this picture today. This in front of the picture here is what's left of the agora. You can kind of see the horse track as it used to be, and also the buildings that were there. And so to our right is the entrance to what would have been where the courts were held and shops and other things that were there. In the background, always in the background of Corinth, is the Acro-Corinth, that mountain where they had on top of it the temple to Aphrodite or Venus. And if we were to move to our left just a little bit, we would also see a better picture of it as well. So just to give you an idea of what maybe our background looked like at the time, but also where it is and what it was used for. This is where that court took place, and many times they heard these cases. Now, let's talk about jurors for a moment, because just one more picture there of what we're looking at. Let's talk about jurors, because this is going to get to the heart of what Paul's talking about, is the jury, people that were part of the jury. Citizens, any citizen above the age of 30 that did not have a criminal record were eligible to serve. Think about, you sign up for jury duty, and if you're selected for it, there are very few ways of getting out of it, but you have your jury selection there. They were eligible to serve as jurors. Again, I put that in a box because they're not really jurors, they're not really judges, they're kind of both. At the beginning of each year, 6,000 citizens, this was for Athens, it may have been a little less for Corinth, but 6,000 citizens were selected by lot at the beginning of the year. And for that entire year, you were considered a juror in the court system there. Now, you didn't have to go every day. They weren't assigned days to work, but they simply went to the square, the agora, when they were willing to serve. They weren't paid a full day's wage, though they were paid something close to it. Some people think that the older members of society, because they didn't necessarily need to work a full day, or they couldn't, then that they were mainly these jurors. But they showed up when they were willing to serve. And every day, the courts in Athens required between 1,500 and 2,000 jurors in order to function. Again, Corinth, a little bit smaller, but not by much. And so, again, Paul is telling them that they don't need to be going to court because of all the people that are hearing all of their dirty laundry. And this gets closer to the point that I've been trying to make all of this time here. In private cases, again, the smaller ones, juries could number between 200 and 400 people. We think of a jury box with 12 people or something like that in it. But in these civil cases that were here, the smaller courts could have at least 200 people and at most 400. And the individuals that are making the complaints and that are taking each other to court, they are the ones that are arguing their case and what they deserve and how they've been wronged in front of at least 200 people. And the larger public cases could be between 500 and 1,000 of these jurors. And so they're putting on a spectacle and giving out all the private information and talking about all the things that they want to talk about in front of all of these people, most of whom, if any at all, are not members of the church. And so this gets closer to our point here that we need to make. And so here are the points that you need to remember in all of that. I enjoy talking about all that, and I get excited about it, but here's the points that we need to keep in mind as we study 1 Corinthians 6. First of all, anyone could take anyone to court. Mostly it was citizens, but even those who weren't citizens could still get in on the action there in the court system. These cases took place in, at best, a semi-public forum where just about anybody could come and watch the performance that was being taken there. Both claimants and defendants alike were responsible for their argument. So if you wanted to take someone to court, you didn't have someone that spoke for you, you spoke. And if you were the defendant in the case, you didn't have someone to defend you, although you could have someone help you write a speech. You had to give the speech yourself. And so you had to defend and claim. There wasn't discovery and things like that where police and others were allowed to see private information. You had to gather all that information and present it to everybody. And telling the truth wasn't always of the utmost importance in the courts as well. And so, and the final thing to keep in mind is that between 200 and 1,000 Corinthian citizens, if we're going to extrapolate the numbers here, heard and judged these cases. These were people that were citizens of the city or from around the city who had no interest or probably had no dealings with the church at Corinth, and yet they sat judging the civil matters between these brethren that were here. And so again, this was something that was big entertainment for them. Let's go down to the courthouse and let's listen to today's speeches. Oh, there's a good one on today because there's two family members that are bickering. Let's go watch that. If you've watched any of those daytime television where the judge has got the two people out in front, that's the same kind of thing. We're no different than they were. But the idea here is that the Christians were not having a Christ-like attitude, and they were getting in just the same as everybody else was. And instead of having love and compassion for each other, they were taking each other to court and taking from each other sometimes things that didn't really belong to them, imagined wrongs or things like that. But Paul doesn't really make a distinction between that. He actually says even if you have someone that's done something wrong to you, you need to take the higher road. Let's get out of the public spectacle about how much we dislike each other or how much I'm owed or what my rights are, and let's get back to being like Jesus. And we'll see that as we go through here. I went through that very quickly because I don't know how many find that interesting, but I wanted to give us that background point, especially the massive number of people that are going to be looking at I keep saying dirty laundry, but that's the idea here, the goings on between people. Very similar to the way that if you get on social media or something and you say that, somebody did not give me back my casserole dish or whatever it is, and you're really mad about it. Everybody sees it, and that's not the way that Jesus would handle it. And that's not the way that Paul wants them to handle it either. But questions or comments just before we go on here? All right, again, there in verse 1. The differences here, we have two people, at least two people who are Christians, claim to be. And in chapter 5, they weren't acting like Christians because they were being overly compassionate in their mind about sin. And then in chapter 6, we have people who are claiming to be Christians, but who aren't acting like it because they are not loving enough. They are perceiving wrongs, or maybe they have been wronged, and instead of taking that and making a sacrifice, what have you, they are proclaiming what they believe to be their right or what they believe to be what they're owed. If we go to Genesis 13, you have there Abraham and Lot, and they were trying, our herdsmen and others aren't getting along, and that shouldn't be. Abraham makes the statement there, we be brethren, that's the idea. Abraham, as the older family member, was owed, because of tradition and because of their law, he was supposed to have picked which land he wanted. Okay, it was his. He had the choice, and according to their law, he had the right to choose. But he gives Lot the choice because we're brethren, and I'd rather you make the choice and you be happy than for me to be happy and you be unhappy. And so because we're brethren, I want you to make that choice. And so this is the idea that Paul is bringing up here, and he's going to talk about it throughout this chapter. And so he mentions there as well, verses 1, I believe he's going to get to it a little bit before, you bring those against your neighbor, you go to law before the unjust or the unrighteous, he says there in verse 1. You're going to law and you're having people who aren't Christians judge matters between Christians, and you haven't even gone through all the channels that you should to before you get to that point. And so we're brethren, we should be able to handle things the right way. Had an elder years ago tell me, and he said many occasions, if two people are both acting like Jesus, there is no problem that they cannot handle. I don't care what it is. If they're both acting like Jesus as Christians, there's no problem that they could not overcome. But they were taking this to outsiders, those who didn't have the best interest at heart, those who weren't Christians, those who had not obeyed the gospel, and they were deciding the things that really they really didn't need to be. And what this did was it reflected badly on the church. And I think this gets to the broader topic. What they were doing, whether it was right or wrong legally, what they were doing was they were broadcasting what the church was to other people. And it wasn't right. It wasn't the right way. And so the way that we behave, the way that we reflect the light into this world is going to have a lot to do with what many people think about the church. You've heard it said before that sometimes you may be the only Bible that some people read. You may be the only glimpse of Jesus that other people ever see. And there has to have been a large percentage of those jurors who walked into that court area who had never heard about the church, and yet this was the very first time they were hearing about what Christians do and behave and act towards one another. And there, I'm sure, were many who walked out of that courtroom and said, I don't know all about that religion they proclaim, but I don't want to have anything to do with it. And this was the problem. It wasn't necessarily going through the court system or dealing with the courts. Paul did that. But he also did it in a manner where people didn't look at him and say, well, I don't want to have anything to do with that religion. They were not behaving the right way. And this was the issue that Paul had with them, not to be taken there before outsiders. It reflects badly on the church. Both Roman law that they were under and American law today recognize private settlements as legally binding. They didn't have to go to the court system in order to fix something. That's another issue as well. There were other less public channels that they could use in order to fix these problems between them. Sometimes the issue could probably be dealt with between just the two people. And yet, their first instinct seems to be, let's go tell as many people as possible. I feel like I can win this case. I feel like I can put on a better show than he does, or what have you. And so that's the issue that he's going to get in here. Again, Paul's going to get to this idea that the church, Christians, should assist in these matters. Not that we're lawyers, and because our system is different than theirs was in certain ways, there are other ways to deal with it. Not saying that we shouldn't ever use the court system. But Christians should assist in these matters. You've got a problem, and you've got a problem. Well, let's talk about it. How can we fix it without letting everybody know there's a problem? We're going to disagree from time to time. But when we broadcast it to the world and we say things perhaps that aren't true, or maybe that are true that no one needs to know about, that reflects badly. And the influence of the church, as we mentioned in chapter 5, that candlestick, that's of the utmost importance. I would rather be wronged and the church or Christ come off looking as they should than for me to get what's mine because it's my right, and in doing so, I've harmed the church or the influence of Jesus in this community. And so that's his point here that he's going to make if I'll ever get to it. Yes, sir.
A quick question.
Yes, sir.
Could women participate in this, and did they use this form for divorce?
Yeah, the question there is were women allowed to take part in the court system, and was this court system used for divorce? I know for the first question, no, they had to be men 30 years of age and older, and they couldn't have a criminal record in order to be on the jury. And while I'm not sure if women could be the ones who were bringing the suit, it looks like men from 18 and older could do that. So I don't believe they could take part in it. Ancient Greek women had more rights than we think about ancient women having. So many of them could vote in certain cases and that sort of thing. But when it comes to the court cases, I don't believe that they could. And civil suits, while today I believe divorce and that sort of thing is umbrellaed under the civil cases, I don't know that this would have been the route that they took. There were other ways to do that in a far more private manner. Now, someone who was related to the woman could claim that she was not treated fairly in a divorce, and then on we go, or away we go with the court proceeding. But this wouldn't have been a divorce case, and it certainly would have been men that were involved in that. Though I'm sure women were able to come and watch because it was good television for the time. Anybody else? All right, verses 2 and 3. Do you not know that the saints shall judge the world? And if the world shall be judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters? Know ye not that you shall judge angels? How much more things that pertain to this life? There's a lot there in verses 2 and 3. There's a lot that Paul mentions there that we kind of look at and say, what does he mean? As far as I can tell, there are three things, especially when it talks about do you not know that the saints will judge the world? What does that mean? Three views as far as I can tell, and commentators are divided on what he means here. The first one is that the Corinthians at some point in the past had made this statement to Paul, that sometime in the future, when Jesus comes back, we the Corinthians, or we Christians, we're going to take part in judging the world. And so Paul is using what they said, even though it wasn't correct, and he's using their own words against them. And so in essence, he is, as he has been, sarcastic. And he tells them, if you're going to judge the world, why are you not able to judge the smallest matters? You're going to judge the world, but you can't judge the small matters. You got to take it before a court. The second one is that the saints judge the world by preaching the gospel. When you and I act differently than the world, in essence, we are judging the world. We're acting as jurors. We behold the scene, we behold the actions of the world, and we choose that's not right. And so in essence, we're judging. Though he talks about it in a future tense, not a present one. But that's the idea there is the second one. The third one is that the saints will associate with Christ in his judgment. Maybe not, certainly not picking and choosing, but it is in the declaring of the punishment that's there. Daniel 7, verses 16 through 22, 18 through 22, in a kind of a symbolic sense, looks at the saints coming in judgment with with God in the end. And so it's one of these three. Perhaps there are other views as well. Personally, I take the first one. I think that Paul was being sarcastic and using their words against them. Maybe number two, I can't quite grasp number three. But number one here, I think, is the idea, because they were so, as we've already seen, so full of themselves and believed that they, Paul said, we're weak and you're strong. We're mighty. We're weak and you're mighty. We're unintelligent and you're the smartest one in the room. He was being sarcastic. And so in essence here, he's using their words against them. You told me before that the saints are going to judge the world, and yet you can't judge a matter of $50 between each other. You've got to take it to court? Really? And so in my mind, that's what he's doing here, though the second one will perhaps would be as well. Now, we do judge the world in our actions or inactions. Ephesians 5, verse 11, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but don't forget the last part, but rather reprove them. Reprove them with your actions. Reprove them with your words. Saints shall judge the world. Now, on the judgment day, it's not going to matter what we decide. On the judgment day, my judgments need to be in agreement with his in order to be correct. Those two roads we mentioned, the wide and the narrow, it's not going to matter what I believe or what I've judged that day. It's going to matter whether or not I lined up with him in this life. Again, more than likely, I think what he's doing here is being sarcastic. He's not saying that we're going to judge the world, because I think that kind of goes against other clearly stated scripture there. In my mind, they knew exactly what he was talking about, and I think he was using their words against them and saying if you're so smart and intelligent and so judicial, why do you need to go to court and do that? Perhaps there's something, some truth to that. Yeah, go ahead. I was going to ask. As well, I think that what they're doing is they were saying, we're going to be able to judge all of them, men and angels. Of course, angels have already been judged; they've already been sentenced. Once we're dead, we've already been judged and sentenced, and so that's kind of why I think he's pointing it out that they've made the statement, and he's just simply using it against them. And I've seen some picture, the saints there with Jesus, and angels and men are being judged, the right and the left, and that sort of thing. And I just can't apply that to what he's saying. It doesn't look like something that's literal in nature. That's why I use the idea that perhaps it's sarcastic. Anything else there? Sometimes he throws out these questions, and they knew what he was talking about, but to us, we stop back and say, hang on a second. What are you saying there? I think he's really trying to, because the point is, they weren't taking the right channel that they needed to, and he's kind of making them see that they're inconsistent in their actions and in their judgments here. Anything, verses 2 and 3.
It's obviously saying the church ought to be good at this judging, which to me, as elders, should be the one that pushes this, but they can't take that authority. We have to give them that authority. And that's what we should do as a congregation. Let the church, if we have a problem with anything in the church, we ought to take it before the elders. That's my opinion. I don't know if that's what we're not. The elders might disagree.
I think that opinion doesn't include what Jesus says about if you have a problem with someone, go to them. And then you follow up with the steps that he gave. I don't think you should just take everything to the elders. If we can clear it, if I can clear it between you and I, then it's done. And nobody else needs to know about it. I don't need to bring the elders and then have a meeting about it.
I think Dan makes a good point, and certainly a couple things to keep in mind. The church here at Corinth had all spiritual gifts, and one of those was the miraculous ability to know truth. And so you had people who would be much better to adjudicate matters than the world was. And so they actually had God-given ability to know what was wrong and what was right on everything. But we also need to keep in mind as well that what Paul is telling them is that they've skipped steps. That they've gone from I feel wronged to I need to tell everybody I've been wronged. And so they've skipped some steps along the way. Even if they needed to go before everybody, you've skipped a lot. You haven't even gone to the person and tried to deal with it. You haven't taken it to wiser people that understand the situation. You haven't even gone to them. What you've done is you've just gone before upwards of 1,000 people and just laid it all out there with no explanation or context. And so, yeah, I think Sam makes a good point. You know, that his idea, Paul's point is that they should be making an effort to keep this as private as possible. Not because we don't want anybody to know necessarily, and we're ashamed of whatever it is. It's that we want to make sure that the church doesn't get the wrong idea about things. And it's very easy. It was then, it is now, for people to get the wrong idea about an ideology or religion or you as an individual simply because someone else makes some kind of statement. If I don't know anything about you and someone comes up and says something about, that's all the information I have to go on. I have nothing else to know. And so because they were skipping these steps, that's one of the reasons that Paul was writing to them. But they also were giving the church a bad look in the eyes of the world. And that's what he wanted to protect. I don't care if you don't ever get your $100 back or whatever the civil case is. What I do care about is that people look and think of the church as a group of people who love each other and want the best. And Dan also mentioned Jesus. You know, Jesus talking about there about a sin against somebody, not necessarily a civil matter. This is some kind of sin there. So I think that's even more broad than what Paul's talking about here. Anything else there in verses 2 and 3? All right, 5 minutes or so here. Let's get verse 4, as he mentions it there. If then you have judgments to things pertaining to this life, set them to judge who are least esteemed in the church. I have the King James up there, and that's what I quote. That's what I learned. So that's kind of what I normally use. However, it's good to know that the King James, just like every version in English we have, it sometimes needs some help. It's not perfect. This is one of those occasions where verse 4 would probably be better to look at a different version. And so I'll put the New American Standard up here so we get a better idea of what he's actually saying. It actually should be a question. He's not making a statement there. He said, if you have law courts dealing with matters of this life, why do you appoint them as judges who are of no account to the church? And I think, to me, I see better that this is sarcasm that he's using here. He said, if you have law courts that deal with simply matters of this life, why do you appoint those jurors and others to judge, and they have no account of the church? They have no context, and they don't even know what you've professed to believe and the kind of things that you need to be living as. So this should be a question here in verse 4. And because of the sarcasm in verses 2 and 3, I think he's really getting to another issue that stems from this division. Again, I think you can take all of the problems from chapter 4 onward, all the problems we're going to see, and it all goes back to division. Because of that division in chapter 1, they were prideful of their toleration of sin in chapter 5. Because of that division in chapter 1, and following men and this kind of thing, it led to toleration of sin, which made them continue to live in such in front of everybody. Again, they went before these jurors and they could say just about anything, and as long as they didn't lose 80% or more of the vote of those 1,000 or however many it is, they weren't fined. And so they could say whatever really they wanted to. And sometimes it was true, sometimes it wasn't. But all the time, mainly, it gave the church at Corinth a bad name. Now, a lot of other things they were doing gave them a name as well, bad name. But this was one of those as well. All of the problems and difficulties that were here at Corinth, and then on top of that, you had people going into the public square to present at least a part of that as a court case or a reason why I should be given what is rightfully mine or this kind of thing. So you see that kind of stemming from division. If they were united, if they had the love that Paul's going to demand of them, this would not have been a problem. So we'll look at that as well. there's our bell right there. We'll finish up with our last thoughts of verse 4 next time that we're together. But again, I appreciate the comments and appreciate your time today. Thanks a lot.